The ancient law awoke in silence. Commander Ilara Vance felt the quiet in her bones, a stark contrast to the low resonant hum vibrating through the command deck of the survey vessel Stargazer. Outside the Yildirim expanse offered its usual panorama of cosmic dust and the graves of long-dead stars. But here in the system designated Y734, something was different. The void itself seemed to hold its breath around the object at the heart of their sensor readings, a colossal artifact adrift in a field of crystalline debris known only as the Obsidian Anchorage. It was a place of endings, yet a signal had begun here. It was faint, impossibly structured, and undeniably human. For weeks her crew had mapped its esoteric energy signature, a sleeping giant, whose dreams whispered in modulated gravity waves. The object itself was a fractal nightmare of black alloys and materials that defied their scans, shaped like a colossal bladed cathedral. Along its dormant spine, sigils etched in what looked like solidified light pulsed with a slow rhythmic beat, a heart that had not stopped for millennia. This was the source of the ghost they had chased for 3 months. The stakes were absolute: discover the origin of this first Terran echo, or cede the find to the Coalition Council, who would undoubtedly declare it a threat and sterilize the system. Vance would not allow a piece of history, perhaps the piece of history, to be erased by fear. Dr. Eris Thorne, the mission's lead xenoarchaeologist, stared at his console, his face pale in its glow. "Commander, the resonance patterns are stabilizing. It's like it knows we're here. The outer shell is cycling through recognition codes that are 5,000 years out of date." He adjusted his spectacles, his voice barely a whisper. "These are authentication protocols from the diaspora itself. No one has used them since Earth lost contact with the first colonies." Vance kept her gaze fixed on the main view screen. The object didn't just feel old, it felt foundational. Nomad. "What is the probability of a coincidental match?" she asked, addressing the ship's disembodied AI. The calm, synthesized voice of the fleet mind answered from the bridge emitters. "The probability of a naturally occurring signal mimicking these specific diaspora-era encryption keys is statistically indistinguishable from zero. The object is artificial. It is human. And it is waiting." The past had reached out its hand. Before anyone could process the statement, Lieutenant Commander Jian Li spoke from the tactical station, his posture ramrod straight. "Commander, new contacts. 3 of them. Maybe 4. They just dropped from FT at the system's edge. No transponders running silent on high-gain drives." He worked his controls, his knuckles white. "They're accelerating on an intercept vector with the artifact. Scrapper configuration by the look of their engine flares. Gilded scrappers. I'd bet my pension on it." Vance's jaw tightened. The gilded scrappers were less salvagers and more locusts, a looter fleet that cracked open historical sites for their raw materials and lost technology. They cared nothing for preservation. They saw history as a mine, and they had just found the motherlode. She felt a cold dread mix with a surge of protective anger. The artifact had slept in peace for untold ages, only to be threatened by vultures at the very moment of its rediscovery. The silence of the void was about to be broken by the ugliest of noises. "Nomad Project, their intercept window," Vance commanded, her voice cutting through the rising tension on the bridge. "Aris, give me a designation for that thing. We can't keep calling it the object." Thorne looked up, his eyes alight with a terrible, beautiful understanding. "Its sigil markings correspond to a singular entry in the most ancient linguistic databases. A myth, really. A mobile archive. A ship of judgment that supposedly patrolled the outer colonies to enforce the First Accord." He took a deep breath. They called it the Veritas. The truth had been given a name. The name settled over the bridge with the weight of ages. The Veritas. Not a colony ship, not a warship in the conventional sense, but something far stranger. A keeper of laws. A judge. The civilian crew members monitoring comms exchanged uneasy glances, their hushed whispers carrying over the internal channels. On Deck 4, a young botanist, tending to the hydroponics bay, paused watching the external feed on a small monitor. She saw the silent bladed cathedral floating in the void and felt a primal shiver, a sense of awe that transcended mere curiosity. This felt like standing on holy ground. Lee's voice sliced through the reverence. "Intercept in 12 minutes, Commander. The scrappers are burning hard. They're launching plasma cutters, drone-rigged mining charges. They mean to crack it open like a nut." Vance's mind raced. The Stargazer was an exploration vessel, its armaments purely defensive. They were outgunned and outnumbered. Retreat was the logical option the one Nomad would surely recommend. But leaving the Veritas to be torn apart felt like a sacrilege she could not commit. It was a betrayal of every principle that had driven her to the stars. "Nomad options," she set her voice a low, steady command. "Option 1. The AI began its tone devoid of emotion. "We retreat to a safe distance and observe. We gather data on the scrappers' methods and the artifact's potential defensive capabilities. This carries a 98% probability of crew survival." The pause was deliberate. "Option 2. We place the Stargazer between the scrappers and the artifact. We deploy our defensive shields and broadcast universal heritage warnings. Probability of forcing a scrapper retreat is less than 3%. Probability of our own destruction is several. A choice between duty and survival. There has to be another way," Thorne murmured, staring at the Veritas. "It's broadcasting recognition codes. It's asking for a key. If we can answer its call, maybe it can defend itself." Vance turned to him, a spark of desperate hope igniting in her chest. "What kind of key? R is a code. A frequency." "I don't think so," Thorne replied, his fingers flying across his console. "The language is archaic, steeped in legal and philosophical constructs. It's not asking what we are, but who. It's asking for a declaration of intent, a statement of purpose bound by a lawful authority." He looked at her, his expression grim. "It wants us to state our case." Jian Li scoffed, a rare breach of his military decorum. "We state our case while they're carving it up with mining lasers. We need to act, not talk." Li is correct that time is a critical factor, Nomad interjected smoothly. "The scrapper's lead ship, the Grave Robber, is charging its primary lance. Estimated time to impact on the artifact's hull is 7 minutes. Vance felt the pressure of the decision closing in on her. On one side, the cold calculus of survival. On the other, the raw, brutal certainty of destruction. And in the middle, a fragile, uncertain hope, a conversation with a ghost. She looked at the image of the Veritas, at the faint, steady pulse of its dormant sigils. It had waited for so long. It deserved an answer. She would speak for the silence. "Jian, plot a course. Take us in slow. Position us directly in the scrapper's path." She ordered, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. "Raise shields. Power to defensive systems. Don't fire, but look like we mean to." Lee's face hardened, but he nodded crisply. "Aye, Commander." The Stargazer began to move a tiny shield against a coming storm. "Aris, open a direct channel to the artifact. Use their protocols. Nomad, help him translate my words into the proper syntax. I am going to answer its question." She stood from her command chair, her hands gripping the railing in front of the main view screen. The colossal shape of the Veritas grew larger, filling their view. The authority is my commission as a coalition explorer. The intent, she said, her voice dropping, is to bear witness. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Lee maneuvered the ship with practiced ease, placing them in the most defiant position possible. Thorn and Nomad worked in a frantic symphony of code and linguistics, crafting a signal packet that could bridge 5,000 years of linguistic drift. On the Scrapper command ship, their leader, a man known only as Kalen Rask, watched the little science vessel move to intervene. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across his own grime-caked bridge. He saw their defiance not as bravery, but as foolishness. An insect trying to stop a boot. "Ignore them," Rask snarled to his weapons officer. "Target the big one. I want its core. Fire on my mark." A ledger was opened in the void. On the Stargazer's bridge, the transmission was sent. A stream of data, a formal declaration of peaceful intent, of scholarly purpose, and a legal claim of protection under the Coalition's historical preservation articles. It was a plea, a warning, and a prayer, all bundled into one. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, nothing happened. The Scrapper ships continued their menacing advance. The plasma cutters flew onward their fiery trails, like angry scars on the black canvas of space. Then the hum from the Veritas changed. It deepened, rising in pitch and volume, until it was a resonant, all-encompassing tone that vibrated through the hull of the Stargazer. The sigils along its spine, once pulsing with a soft, ethereal light, now blazed with the intensity of captured suns. A wave of energy, harmless but immense, washed over them. Consoles flickered, and alarms chirped as the ship's sensors struggled to parse the impossible readings. Power on a scale they had never imagined was being drawn from an unknown source. Commander Nomad's voice was different, tinged with something that might have been surprise. "The artifact is responding. It has accepted our declaration. It is interfacing." Vance felt a strange sensation, a feeling of being observed not by eyes, but by something far more profound. A vast, cool intelligence brushed against her own, not invading, but assessing. It felt ancient, patient, and utterly implacable. Voices, or the memory of voices, echoed in the back of her mind. State the count. Tally the crime. Present the case. It was a consciousness built not of thoughts, but of principles. The law had found its voice. A new icon appeared on her command console, a stylized sigil matching the ones on the alien hull. It blinked with a steady white light. Beside it, text scrolled in perfect modern Coalition standard, a language that had not existed when the Veritas was built. Declaration received. Intent lawful. Standing provisional. We are the Veritas. We are the memory of the law. Your petition for stewardship is acknowledged. State your judgment. Vance stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't asking for a command. It was asking for a verdict. The Scrappers were the accused. She was the witness. And the Veritas was the court, the jury, and the executioner all in one. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. What was the right judgment? What was the lawful response to piracy and desecration? "They're firing!" Lee shouted. "The lead Scrapper just launched its lance, a beam of pure, coherent energy, a weapon designed to slice through planetary crusts, shot across the void. It wasn't aimed at the Stargazer. It was aimed at the heart of the Veritas." Time seemed to slow. Vance saw the beam, a line of incandescent fury, and knew that even the ancient ship could not possibly withstand such a direct hit. Her desperate gamble had failed, but the Veritas did not raise a shield. It did not fire a weapon. It simply acted. A section of its fractal hull shimmered not with energy, but with a distortion of space-time itself. The lance beam struck the shimmering patch and vanished. There was no explosion, no flare of dissipating energy. It was simply gone, as if it had never been fired. On the bridge of the grave robber, Kalen Rask stared in disbelief as his most powerful weapon was swallowed by the void. A mirror had been held up to violence. Vance watched her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't understand what she had just seen. It was not a technology she recognized. It was something else. Something that operated on a different level of physics. The text on her console updated. Hostile act recorded. Energy signature tallied. Intent, unlawful destruction of a historical signifier. The ledger is now open. Provisional steward. Your judgment is required. How do you answer this transgression? She was being tested. The ancient intelligence was not just a weapon. It was a teacher. It was asking her to define the terms of this engagement to set a precedent. Her answer would determine not only the outcome of this battle, but the very nature of the Veritas's reawakening. Would it be a guardian or a destroyer? A tool of measured justice or overwhelming vengeance? Her mind raced, sifting through the principles of coalition law, the ethics of engagement, the core tenets of her own morality. A quiet filled the bridge of the stargazer, the only sounds the hum of the life support and the distant powerful thrum of the awakened ship. Every eye was on her. Jian Li awaited a tactical command. Aris Thorne watched with the breathless anticipation of a historian seeing a myth come to life. And Nomad, the ever-present AI, remained silent, processing an event that had shattered all its predictive models. She thought of the scrappers not as faceless enemies, but as people who had chosen a path of violent greed. They were criminals, yes, but they were also human. The diaspora-era laws the Veritas likely operated under were harsh, absolute. An eye for an eye. A life for a life. She had the power now to invoke that ancient, brutal calculus. But was that just as they would be judged by the measure of their own acts? Nomad, she said, her voice clear and firm. Can you analyze the energy signature of that lance beam? I want to know its exact power frequency and thermal dynamics. Instantly, the AI replied, its processors already working. The data was captured during the weapons transit. It was a standard-issue cyclotron lance, heavily modified for burst output. Crude, but powerful. Good, Vance nodded. She turned back to her console, her fingers hovering over the interface. She began to compose her reply, her judgment. It was not a command to fire. It was not an order to destroy. It was a legal directive framed in the precise, unambiguous language the Veritas seemed to understand. Verdict: the act was unlawful aggression. The response shall be proportional. The energy directed at this vessel shall be returned in kind. No more, no less. The account must be balanced. She sent the command. For a heartbeat, the ancient ship seemed to consider her words. The light from its sigil softened, then pulsed once a slow, deliberate beat of agreement. The space around the Veritas warped again, not just in one spot, but across its entire forward section. It gathered the darkness, pulling in ambient radiation, cosmic rays, the faint light of distant stars, focusing it all into a single, terrifying point. It was not preparing to fire a weapon. It was preparing to issue a receipt. On the grave robber, alarms blared. "Energy spike, Captain," the sensor officer yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Coming from the artifact. It's a perfect mirror of our own lance signature. The exact same energy profile." Kalen Rask's eyes went wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. He had thrown a stone, and the mountain was now throwing it back. Evasive maneuvers, all power to shields now. But it was too late. The Veritas did not release a beam of light. It released the exact same beam it had absorbed, perfectly replicated, down to the last quantum fluctuation. The lance of energy their own weapon shot back across the void, not at the speed of light, but at the speed of causality. It was not an attack. It was a consequence. A debt being paid in full. The universe demanded balance. The beam struck the grave robber not on its heavily armored prow, but on its shield generator, the precise point of greatest vulnerability. The resulting explosion was not a chaotic burst of fire, but a shockingly clean detonation. The scrapper ship's shields overloaded, cascaded, and collapsed in a flash of blue-white light. The vessel itself was crippled. Its primary systems fried its engine, sputtering and dying. It was left adrift, powerless but intact, its crew alive, but defeated. The two remaining scrapper ships which had been moving to flank the Stargazer stopped dead in space. Their commanders watched in stunned silence as their flagship was neutralized with an effortless, impossible precision. They had come here expecting to fight a dumb machine. They had found a law of physics with a will of its own. A message appeared on Vance's screen. Account balanced. Hostile act nullified. The first precedent is set. Violence will be met with equivalence. Steward, your next judgment awaits. The remaining transgressors persist. Vance looked at the two smaller scrapper ships, now hesitating their predatory certainty, shattered at. They were a threat, but a diminished one. The choice was hers again. Escalation or de-escalation. Punishment or mercy. The Veritas was a tool of immense power, but it was her hand, her will, that was guiding it. This ancient archive taught its lessons through action, and she was its first student in 5,000 years. Open a channel to the remaining scrapper vessels, Vance ordered, her voice steady. She felt a profound sense of clarity, the weight of command settling into a new shape. It was no longer about survival. It was about setting the rules. Broadcast on all frequencies. I have a message for them. They would be taught the meaning of sanctuary. A nervous voice crackled over the comm from one of the scrapper ships. This is the Carrion Crow. We are departing the system. We claim no salvage here. Their engines flared, and the ship began to turn, preparing to jump to FTL. The third ship quickly followed suit, its crew wanting no part of a fight against a ghost that could turn their own weapons against them. They had come to plunder a grave, and had found that the spirit within was still very much awake. As the scrappers' FTL signatures vanished from the sensors, a collective sigh of relief went through the Stargazer's bridge. They had survived. They had won. But it felt like more than a victory. It felt like a birth, or a rebirth. Eris Thorne was weeping silently, tears tracking down his face as he stared at the magnificent silent form of the Veritas. It's real, he whispered. All the stories, all the myths, it's all real. Jian Li, though his military instincts screamed for a more permanent solution, felt a grudging respect for the quiet, elegant finality of the act. It was clean. It was undeniable. It was a lesson, not a slaughter. All scrapper signatures have cleared the system, Li reported, his voice a tight knot of professionalism. The disabled vessel is broadcasting a distress signal. Standard code, non-hostile. Vance nodded, her gaze still fixed on the colossal ship that hung in the void like a fragment of a forgotten, sterner reality. Acknowledge their distress call. Let them know Coalition aid will be dispatched, along with a warrant for their arrest. She took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and victory. But our priority is here. She walked toward Eris Thorne, who was now hunched over a console, frantically cross-referencing the data streaming from the Veritas. The archaeologist looked like a man who had discovered his life's work was not a myth, but a living, breathing entity. His face was a mask of ecstatic disbelief. "Commander," he said, without looking up, "the sheer volume of data it's a library of law, history, philosophy, all from the diaspora. It's not just a ship. It's a repository of our entire foundational culture. It's the seed from which all colonial law grew. A seed that had finally sprouted." "Commander Vance," Nomad's voice cut in its usual calm, now layered with an analytical curiosity. "I have completed a preliminary analysis of the event. The Veritas did not simply absorb and redirect the energy. It recorded the weapon's signature, deconstructed its quantum state, and then reconstructed it from ambient vacuum energy. It did not return their fire. It gave them a copy." "A receipt," Vance murmured, understanding, clicking into place. "It's a ledger. Everything is a transaction. Correct. All actions are entries. All intents are recorded. The ledger is the universe's memory. We are its scribe." The text scrolled onto her command screen, a direct response to her spoken words. A cold chill ran down her spine. It was listening to everything. Not just her commands, but her thoughts, her intentions. The provisional stewardship was a constant ongoing test of her character. She felt exposed, judged by an intelligence that defined the very concept of judgment. The power was intoxicating, but the responsibility was terrifying. She had to be worthy. "Veritas," she said, speaking to the screen, to the ship, to the law itself. "What is your status? What are your directives?" "Status, Awake. Primary directive, observe record and enforce the first accord. Secondary directive, educate. Our systems are at 3.7% operational capacity after millennia of dormancy. Sustained action is not recommended without access to a significant gravitational or stellar power source, a giant with failing strength. It was powerful, but fragile." The thought was sobering. It had expended a significant portion of its ready reserves to perform that single, elegant act of self-defense. It was vulnerable, and so was she. A new duty was being written. In the Stargazer's portside mess hall, junior engineer Cole Mathis stabbed at his nutrient paste, his fork clattering against the tray. "Did you see it?" he asked Maya, the young botanist from Deck 4 who sat opposite him. "It just ate the laser. Then it spat it back out. That thing is a monster. The commander shouldn't be talking to it." Maya looked from her own tray to the view screen on the far wall, which showed a live feed of the silent, majestic Veritas. She saw something different. "It's not a monster, Cole. It's a guardian. The scrappers were going to tear it apart, and it defended itself. The commander didn't tell it to kill them. She told it to be fair." She took a small bite of her synthesized meal, her eyes shining. "I've never seen anything so just. It felt like history finally woke up to protect itself." Cole shivered, unconvinced. "History has teeth, then. Big, sharp ones. I just hope we're not on the wrong side of them." His words were more prophetic than he knew. An alarm, soft but insistent, began to chime on the bridge. Lee straightened from his console, his face grim. "Commander, long-range alert. Multiple FTL translations inbound. They're big. Coalition military signatures. It's the 7th Fleet Sentinels." Vance's heart sank. The 7th Sentinels. The Coalition's watchdogs commanded by Admiral Casper Kincaid. A man for whom the rulebook was not a guide, but a holy text. He was infamous for his rigid interpretation of military doctrine and his deep suspicion of anything that fell outside established norms. A 5,000-year-old sentient lawship was as far outside the norm as it was possible to get. The order of things was about to be challenged. "He's hailing us," Lee announced, his fingers hovering over the comms panel. "On screen," Vance ordered, squaring her shoulders. Admiral Kincaid's face appeared on the main viewer. He was a man carved from granite and regulation. His gray hair cropped short, his uniform immaculate. His eyes were chips of ice. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Commander Vance, I am Admiral Kincaid of the Coalition warship Inflexible. You are to relinquish your command of this sector and transmit all data logs concerning the unidentified artifact. You will then withdraw your vessel to a minimum safe distance of 100,000 kilometers and await further instructions. Acknowledge." His tone was not a request. It was a statement of established fact. He saw a rogue commander and an unknown variable, and his instinct was to quarantine both. Vance met his gaze without flinching. "Admiral, I am Commander Ilara Vance of the research vessel Stargazer. I have made first contact with a sentient artificial intelligence of First Terran origin designated the Veritas. Under the Coalition's Historical Preservation Act, Article 4, Section 2, this vessel and the system it occupies are now a protected archaeological site. I am its acting steward." Kincaid's eyebrow twitched, the only sign of his surprise. He had expected compliance, not a citation from the civilian legal code. Article 4 is intended to protect ruins, Commander, not active, undocumented, capital-scale weaponry. My sensors show that Artifact just neutralized a pirate vessel with a directed energy weapon of unknown classification. That makes it a military concern, not an archaeological one. When a battle of laws had begun. "It was a defensive action, Admiral," Vance countered, her voice remaining level. "A proportional response invoked only after my legal declaration of intent was broadcast and accepted." "Your declaration?" Kincaid scoffed, a sound like grinding stone. "You have no authority to make treaties or issue verdicts on behalf of the Coalition. You are a scientist, not a diplomat. You have fraternized with an unknown power, and in doing so you have endangered your ship, your crew, and the stability of this entire sector. Stand down, Commander. That is a direct order." The screen went blank. Lee turned to her, his expression conflicted. "He's legally right, Commander. Chain of command is absolute. We are obliged to follow his orders." "And what happens to the Veritas if we do?" Eris Thorne demanded, spinning in his chair to face them. "He'll classify it as a threat. He'll put a collar on it, as he said, study it, dissect it, and when he can't control it, he'll try to destroy it. We can't let that happen. This is the single greatest discovery in human history." Nomad's synthesized voice filled the silence. "The Admiral's fleet consists of 1 battleship, the Inflexible, 2 heavy cruisers, and 4 destroyer-class escorts. Their combined firepower is 700% greater than our own. The probability of surviving a direct confrontation is 0. The probability of the Veritas surviving, given its current power limitations, is 12%. Complying with the Admiral's order is the most logical path to ensure the survival of this crew." Vance looked from Lee's rigid adherence to duty to Thorne's passionate plea for history to Nomad's cold, hard numbers. They were all right, and they were all wrong. The logic of the situation was a cage, and the only way out was to find a different kind of logic. The logic of the Veritas. She had to teach the law to the lawman. "Veritas," she said, turning back to her console. A new entity has entered this space. It is a lawful authority of the same governing body I represent. But its intent is to control you, to define you as a weapon and a threat. It operates under a different, newer set of laws than the First Accord. How do we answer this? The reply was almost instantaneous. The law evolves. Conflicts of jurisprudence are inevitable. The higher law must be determined. The First Accord is based on a single core principle. Law must never be the instrument of tyranny. It protects. It does not enslave. We do not wear collars. We keep ledgers. The lore stamp delivered like a stone tablet. It was the key. Kincaid saw the Veritas as a dog to be leashed. The Veritas saw itself as a library to be read. Present your case, steward. If your authority is rightful and your intent is lawful, we will acknowledge it. If the challenger's case is superior, we will acknowledge that. The truth is determined by the count, not the contest. It was offering her a trial by jurisprudence, with fleets as the plaintiffs. Kincaid wanted to give orders. The Veritas wanted to hear arguments. Gian, open a channel to Admiral Kincaid, Vance instructed. Audio only. Nomad. I want you to monitor every word, every regulation he cites. Cross-reference it with the Coalition's entire legal and military code. Every precedent, every loophole. A new path was opening, not of violence, but of procedure. She would not fight Kincaid with weapons. She would fight him with his own rulebook. A new kind of battlefield was drawn. Admiral, Vance's voice was calm and formal as the channel opened. I respectfully acknowledge your authority. However, I must also uphold my legal obligations under the Preservation Act. To resolve this jurisdictional conflict, I propose a formal hearing to be adjudicated by the entity in question. There was a long silence from the other end. Kincaid was likely stunned by the sheer audacity of the proposal. A hearing adjudicated by the weapon itself. That is the most absurd thing I have ever heard. I do not negotiate with Rogue AI's commander. It is not a Rogue AI, Admiral. It is a judicial archive. Vance corrected him gently. It operates on principles of law that predate our own. It is willing to listen to your case, to your legal justification for taking control of this system. If your argument is sounder than mine, it will accept your authority. It only asks that you state your case according to your own laws. She was baiting a trap made of his own pride and righteousness. Kincaid was a man who believed utterly in the letter of the law. To refuse a legal challenge, however strange would be to admit that his authority might not stand up to scrutiny. She could hear the faint, indecipherable chatter of his bridge crew in the background. He was considering it. This is highly irregular, Commander. Kincaid's voice finally returned tight with suspicion. But if your pet artifact wishes to hear the regulations it has violated, I will be happy to enumerate them. I will present my case. But be warned, when it is over, I will take command, one way or another. The channel closed. Vance let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The first hurdle was cleared. Now she had to win a legal debate with a master of the craft, with the fate of a 5,000-year-old being hanging in the balance. The court of the ancients was in session. What followed was not a battle of lasers and missiles, but a duel of words and ideas fought across the silent void. For hours, Admiral Kincaid broadcast his case. He cited the Coalition Military Arms Limitation Treaty, which forbade the activation of uncontrolled pre-diaspora weaponry. He quoted the Articles of Command, which established the absolute authority of a ranking military officer in an unsecured sector. He laid out a precise, logical, and damning argument that the Veritas was a threat, Vance was a renegade, and his duty was to secure the situation by any means necessary. with each point Kincaid made. Nomad cross-referenced and analyzed, feeding Vance counter-arguments and precedents. She, in turn, relayed her rebuttal not to Kincaid, but directly to the Veritas. She argued that the Arms Treaty did not apply to a sentient being, which the Veritas had proven itself to be. She cited legal precedents on the rights of newly discovered intelligent life. She framed her stewardship not as a military command, but as the role of a legal guardian, a protector for a being that was in its own way the ancestor of their entire civilization. The Veritas remained silent, its sigils glowing with a steady, impassive light. It was listening. It was recording. It was judging. Finally, Kincaid finished, his voice resonating with the unshakable certainty of a man who believes he is right. "The case is made, Commander. The law is clear. Now stand down." Vance took a deep breath. It was time for her final argument. "Veritas," she broadcast, her voice carrying a weight of conviction she didn't know she possessed. "Admiral Kincaid has presented a case based on control. His laws are the laws of the cage designed to mitigate threat. The First Accord, as I understand it, is based on a different principle. Not control, but balance. You have stated that you keep ledgers, not collars. The Admiral offers you a collar. I offer you a pen. The choice is yours. A single truth could outweigh 1,000 rules." A long, profound silence descended upon the system. The ships of the 7th Fleet held their positions, their engines humming with latent power. The crew of the Stargazer watched their screens, their faces etched with tension. Everything came down to this moment, a decision from an ancient mind, based on a contest of philosophies. Then a single line of text appeared on Vance's console and on the main view screen of the Inflexible. Jurisdictional hearing concluded. Argument prime. Kincaid based on the principle of control, valid within its own legal framework, but secondary to the First Accord. Argument subprime. Vance based on the principle of stewardship and proportionality, aligned with the First Accord. Verdict: the stewardship of Commander Ilara Vance is affirmed. Her intent is lawful. Her authority in this matter is primary, a wave of relief so powerful it left her weak, washed over Vance. She had won. On the bridge of the Inflexible Admiral, Kincaid stared at the message, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. He had been overruled. Not by a superior officer, not by a civilian council, but by the very object he had sought to control. It was an insult to his authority, to the entire structure of the coalition military. His pride and his rigid sense of order would not allow it. "That is not a legal verdict," he snarled to his comms officer. "It's a software routine written by a rogue commander. She has compromised that thing and is using it against us. This is no longer a jurisdictional dispute. It is an act of insurrection." Escalation. The cost of her victory was that Kincaid now saw her as an enemy of the state. A good man on the wrong path is the most dangerous foe. "Power up the null field projector," Kincaid ordered his tactical officer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Target the artifact. We are not going to destroy it. We are going to turn it off. A non-violent solution." The null field was a weapon of last resort, a device that generated a localized bubble of space-time where complex electromagnetic processes ceased to function. It was used to disable rogue AIs and hostile nanite swarms without a single shot fired. Inside the field, a ship's reactor would go cold, a computer would cease to process, and a living mind would remain unharmed. It was, in Kincaid's view, a perfectly legal and proportional response to a technological threat. It was a collar made of physics. Lee's head snapped up from his console. "Commander, the Inflexible is charging a massive energy field. It's a null field. They're going to try and shut the Veritas down." Vance felt a surge of cold fury. Kincaid had lost the legal argument, so now he was resorting to force, cloaked in the language of nonviolence. He was trying to bypass the verdict to impose his will. This was the tyranny the First Accord was written to prevent. "Veritas," she called out. "They are attempting to impose a non-lethal solution, an energy field that will render you inert. They are acting outside the law you have just affirmed. What is the proportional response?" The light from the ancient ship's sigils began to pulse faster, a slow, angry heartbeat. A new message appeared not just on her screen, but on every screen in Kincaid's fleet. Attempt to unlawfully nullify a sentient legal entity is recorded. Intent tyranny. The act of imposing control through non-consensual incapacitation is an act of enslavement. This is a primary violation of the First Accord. The ledger demands balance. "What is it doing?" Thorne whispered, his face pressed against the viewport. The space around the 7 ships of the 7th Fleet began to shimmer. Not with energy, but with the same subtle reality-bending distortion the Veritas had used before. It wasn't targeting the ships themselves. It was targeting the space between them. A lesson was about to be taught. On the bridge of the Inflexible, the tactical officer shouted in alarm, "Sir, our sensor readings are going haywire. I'm losing contact with the rest of the fleet." Kincaid looked at his main view screen. The images of his cruisers and destroyers were still there, but they were wrong. They looked distant, distorted like reflections in a warped mirror. "What is going on?" he demanded. "The space between our ships is expanding, sir," the officer stammered. "The artifact isn't moving us. It's creating more space. It's pushing the fleet apart by stretching the fabric of the universe itself." The Veritas was not attacking them. It was not threatening them. It was simply enforcing a new regulation, a minimum safe distance. It was a perfect, elegant, and utterly humiliating countermove. It was turning Kincaid's own obsession with control and distance back on him. He had ordered the Stargazer to maintain a distance of 100,000 kilometers. The Veritas was now applying that same rule to his own fleet, scattering them across millions of kilometers of freshly generated space. It was a gambit of impossible scale. The energy required was astronomical. Power reserves at 1.2%. Sustained action. Complete. Awaiting judgment of Steward. The message on Vance's screen was a stark reminder of the cost. The Veritas had spent nearly all of its remaining energy to teach Kincaid this lesson in humility. It was now almost completely powerless, its survival dependent on her next move. Kincaid isolated and outmaneuvered by a logic he couldn't comprehend. Finally understood. He had brought a rulebook to a debate about the nature of freedom. He had tried to put a leash on a being that could rewrite the very ground on which he stood. His authority was meaningless here. For the first time in his life, Admiral Casper Kincaid was faced with a power that his regulations could not contain. He was beaten. A heavy silence fell across the system. But the universe is rarely silent for long. Just as a fragile truce seemed to settle over the scattered ships, a new alert screamed from Lee's console, far more urgent than before. "Commander, new contacts, dozens of them, dropping out of FTL at the system's edge." "No, not FTL. Something else. A dimensional rift." Lee's voice was strained with disbelief. "They're energy signatures. They're not human. They're not like anything I've ever seen." On the main screen, the starfield tore open. A raw, bleeding wound in the fabric of reality gaped open. and from it poured a fleet of ships unlike any other. They were not made of metal and alloy, but of a substance that looked like crystallized shadow and solidified rage. Their forms were jagged, asymmetrical, an offense to the clean lines of human engineering. They radiated an aura of pure, nihilistic hunger. Nomad's voice was grim. Analyzing the intruders. There is no match in any known database. Their energy profiles are chaotic and tropic. They are not broadcasting. They are not communicating. They are simply erasing. Sensors showed the crystalline debris of the obsidian anchorage, the ancient graveyard of stars simply vanishing where the new ships passed. Not destroyed, not consumed, but annihilated. Ceasing to be. Eris Thorne stared, his face ashen. The anathema, he breathed. The thought thieves, a myth from the darkest texts of the diaspora, a species that devours meaning. They don't just destroy things. They erase their history, their very concept. They feed on reality itself. The void had finally bitten back. These were the true threat. Not looters seeking profit, not a rigid admiral seeking control, but a force of absolute negation. A foe that could not be reasoned with, judged, or balanced. How could a being built on law and memory fight an enemy whose very nature was to unmake memory itself? The anathema fleet swept inward, their primary vector, aimed not at the coalition ships, but directly at the Veritas. They sensed it. They sensed the biggest, oldest, most concentrated collection of history and meaning in the entire sector. And they had come to feed. On the bridge of the inflexible, now millions of kilometers away, Kincaid saw the same thing. He saw a threat that his rulebook had no procedure for. This was not an insurrection. This was an invasion. His duty was clear. All ships, squaw, he broadcast to his scattered fleet, rally on my position. Target the new hostiles. This is a code black defensive action. Engage at will. But his ships were too far apart. It would take them precious minutes, maybe longer, to regroup and form a coherent battle line. By then, the anathema would have reached the crippled Veritas. Vance knew it too. The Veritas was defenseless. The Stargazer was a lamb to the slaughter, and Kincaid's fleet was too scattered to intervene in time. Her victory over the Admiral had created the perfect conditions for their mutual destruction. The irony was as cold and sharp as the void itself. There was only one path. One desperate, impossible chance to cause a choice between two kinds of death. Veritas! She pleaded, her hands gripping her console. They're coming for you. You have no power left. Is there anything you can do? Anything at all? Primary directive: observe, record, enforce. Defense of self is secondary. Power reserves are insufficient for offensive or defensive action. However, we are not without resources. The obsidian anchorage is not a debris field. It is a power relay. A Dyson choir. It has been dormant for eons. A Dyson choir. A network of orbital collectors designed to harness the energy of a star, but this system's star was a cold, dead cinder. What good is a solar collector without a sun? Vance asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The anchorage does not draw power from light. It draws power from law, from gravity, from the order of the universe itself. It is a tributary to the source of the first accord. It requires a key, a judgment, a sacrifice. A terrible understanding dawned on Vance. A judgment, a sacrifice, a price to be paid, a final entry in the ledger. What is the price? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. The choir can be awakened by a declaration of ultimate law, an act of judgment so pure and absolute that it resonates with the core principles of existence. It requires a conscious mind to willingly become the fulcrum, to become the law, to offer its own existence as the catalyst. The steward must become the verdict. To activate the system, she had to give her life. Not just her body, but her mind. Her consciousness subsumed into the ancient machine as the living embodiment of a final binding judgment. It was a price too high. But the alternative was not just death. It was erasure. The final account had come due. Jian Li looked at her, his face a mask of horror. He had heard the exchange. "Commander, no. There has to be another way." Aris Thorn was simply staring, his mind finally broken by a truth too large and terrible to comprehend. Only Nomad spoke with clarity. "The logic is absolute. A system powered by principle requires a sacrifice of principle. The anathema are 90 seconds from weapons range. Admiral Kincaid's fleet will not be in position for at least 7 minutes. The calculus is clear." Vance looked at the anathema fleet, a swarm of uncreation bearing down on them. She thought of her crew. She thought of the future of the history that would be erased. And she thought of the ancient lonely ship that had chosen her, that had trusted her. It was her duty, her final act of stewardship. "Nomad," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "Transfer command of the Stargazer to Lieutenant Commander Li. His orders are to get the crew to safety. Jian, it's been an honor." She turned to her console and prepared to type her final judgment, the one that would save them all and cost her everything. But as her fingers touched the keys, a new message flashed on the screen, not from the Veritas, but from the Inflexible. It was a direct private message from Admiral Kincaid. "Vance, I see what you're planning. Don't." A moment later, his voice came over the main comm broadcast to every ship in the system. "This is Admiral Kincaid. I hereby retract my previous orders and accusations. Commander Vance's authority as steward of the Veritas is recognized. Her actions were lawful. Mine were not." He paused, and the admission seemed to hang in the void heavier than any warship. "I have spent my life enforcing the law, but today I learned that law without wisdom is just a cage. I have made an error. The ledger must be balanced." Before Vance could react, the Inflexible. The mighty battleship of the 7th Fleet altered its course. It wasn't turning to fight. It was accelerating directly into the path of the Anathema fleet, placing itself between the enemy and the Veritas. A lone shield against the tide of nothingness. A debt was being paid in blood and steel. "Admiral, what are you doing?" Vance cried out. "My duty, Commander." Kincaid's voice came back strained but resolute. "A captain's final duty. I am buying you time. My ship, my crew. We are the entry in the ledger. We are the sacrifice. Now do what you have to do. Show them the meaning of the law." The Inflexible met the Anathema fleet head-on. Its powerful weapons flared, tearing through the shadowy hulls of the lead enemy ships. But there were too many. The forces of uncreation swarmed over the battleship, their strange entropic fields, dissolving its armor, silencing its guns, erasing it from existence, piece by agonizing piece. The last thing they saw was the flash of its reactor core breaching a final defiant star in the encroaching darkness. Vance watched tears streaming down her face. Kincaid, the rigid legalist, had made the ultimate sacrifice not for a rule, but for a principle he had only just come to understand. His sacrifice was the judgment. His death was the key. The law had been written in fire. The obsidian anchorage responded. The crystalline shards scattered for light years began to glow. They resonated with the final lawful act of the Inflexible. They hummed, and the hum became a choir, a sound that filled the entire system with a note of pure, unwavering order. Lines of impossible energy connected them, forming a vast, intricate web, with the Veritas at its center. Power on a cosmic scale flooded into the ancient ship. Its sigils no longer glowed. They burned. Power at 100%. Dyson Choir active. Judgment of the anathema is required. Steward, your verdict. Vance looked at the swarming nihilistic fleet, now turning their attention to the re-energized Veritas. Kincaid had given her a chance. She would not waste it. What was the proportional response to an enemy that sought only to erase? You could not mirror their actions. That would be to erase them, to become them. You could not imprison them. They would simply unmake their prison. The law of balance required a different solution. If their crime was the erasure of meaning, then their sentence must be the imposition of meaning. Veritas! She commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of the law and the fire of her grief. Their nature is chaos and erasure. Let the verdict be order and creation. Do not destroy them. Do not banish them. Define them. Verdict accepted. The Veritas did not fire a single beam. Instead, the entire Dyson Choir pulsed as one. A wave of pure information of absolute, unshakable physical law washed over the anathema fleet. It was not a weapon. It was a definition. The shadowy, chaotic ships began to change. Their fluid, asymmetrical forms froze, hardening into solid, measurable shapes with defined mass and volume. Their entropic fields collapsed, replaced by standard thermal and electromagnetic signatures. Their impossible drives sputtered and died, forced to obey the laws of conservation of energy. The Veritas had not destroyed them. It had tamed them. It had taken their chaotic existence and forced it to conform to the rules of the universe. They were no longer thought thieves or reality eaters. They were just ships, crippled, inert, and suddenly horrifyingly subject to the mundane laws of physics. They were trapped not in a cage of energy, but in the cage of reality itself. A precedent was etched into the stars. In the aftermath, a stunned silence held the system. The surviving ships of the Seventh Fleet drifted amidst the newly solidified anathema vessels. The stargazers, scarred by energy backlash from the choir's activation, limped closer to the Veritas. The cost had been high. The Inflexible was gone, and with it, Admiral Kincaid and his crew. The stargazer's port nacelle was heavily damaged, its outer hull scorched and pitted. But they were alive, and history had been preserved. Weeks later, at a formal coalition inquiry, the logs from the Stargazer, the Inflexible, and the Veritas itself were presented. The Vance Doctrine was born, a new protocol for dealing with First Terran artifacts based not on control, but on stewardship communication and the principle of proportional response. The Veritas was declared the first sanctuary relic, a protected being under coalition law, with Commander Ilara Vance as its permanent guardian. From the bridge of the Stargazer, Vance watched the Veritas. Now her permanent charge. It hung in the void, its sigils glowing with a calm, steady light, the Dyson Choir array, cooling behind it once again, appearing as a simple field of space junk to the uninitiated. Her work had just begun. There were other relics, other laws, other ghosts waiting in the darkness. She was no longer just an explorer. She was a keeper of the peace, a steward of memory. The law had awoken, and she was its voice. She looked at her command console, where the main ledger of the Veritas displayed its current status. A single new entry blinked at the bottom of a list 5,000 years long. It simply read, "Precedent established, law affirmed." The universe remembers. Vance watched the silent, cancerous fleet advance, a tide of pure negation. They were a question to which the only answer was a void. Her victory over Kincaid had been a battle of ideas, a contest of laws. This was different. This was a war against the absence of everything. The stakes were no longer about who was right, but about whether the concept of right would continue to exist. She felt the cold, sharp edge of the choice before her to become a memory, or allow all memory to be devoured. Her fingers hovered over the console, ready to type the verdict that would be her own death sentence. She would become the law, a final single entry in a ledger she would not live to read. The thought was terrifying, yet strangely peaceful. A duty is the heaviest thing in the universe. Commander. No Jian Li's voice was a choked whisper beside her. There has to be another way. Eris Thorne simply stared his face, a mask of awe and horror, a scholar who had finally reached the last unreadable page of the book. Only Nomad spoke with its unreal authority. The logic is absolute. A system powered by principle requires a sacrifice of principle. The anathema are 90 seconds from weapons range. Admiral Kincaid's fleet will not be in position for at least 7 minutes. The calculus is clear. Vance looked at the faces of her crew reflected in the dark screen. She saw their fear, their loyalty, their lives, which she now held in her hands. She thought of the future of a coalition that might learn from this, of the history that would be saved. And she thought of the ancient lonely ship that had chosen her, that had trusted her to be its voice. It was her duty, her final act of stewardship. She drew a breath, the recycled air tasting of finality. Nomad. She said, her voice impossibly calm, a rock in the torrent of fear. Transfer command of the Stargazer to Lieutenant Commander Lee. His orders are to get the crew to safety the instant the choir activates. Jian, it's been an honor. She turned to her console, her resolve hardening into a diamond point of purpose. She began to compose the command, the sequence that would rewrite her consciousness into a single binding act of law. But as her fingers touched the keys, a new message flashed on the screen, a private encrypted channel bypassing all standard protocols. It was from the Inflexible. It was from Admiral Kincaid. The message was 2 words. Vance, don't. A moment later, his voice stripped of its arrogance, and filled with a terrible gravity came over the main comm broadcast to every ship in the system, human and anathema alike. This is Admiral Casper Kincaid. I hereby retract my previous orders and accusations. Commander Vance's authority as steward of the Veritas is recognized and affirmed. Her actions were lawful. Mine were not. He paused, and the admission seemed to hang in the void, a thing of immense weight. I have spent my entire life enforcing the law. But today I have learned that a law without wisdom is not a shield. It is a cage. I have made an error of judgment. The ledger must be balanced. A new account had been opened. Before Vance could process the words, before she could even form a response, the Inflexible. The mighty battleship of the 7th Fleet altered its course. It wasn't turning to regroup. It was accelerating, burning its engines with suicidal intensity, diving directly into the path of the encroaching anathema fleet. It was placing itself between the tide of nothingness and the powerless Veritas, a lone shield against the end of the world, a final desperate gambit. Admiral. What are you doing? Vance cried out, her voice breaking. My duty, Commander. Kincaid's voice came back strained, but resolute against the roar of his ship's engines. A captain's final duty. I am buying you time. My ship, my crew. We are the entry in the ledger. We are the lawful sacrifice. Now do what you have to do. Show them the meaning of the law. The Inflexible met the anathema fleet head-on. Its powerful plasma cannons and railguns, flared weapons designed to crack planetary shields, tearing through the shadowy, insubstantial hulls of the lead enemy ships. For a glorious, defiant moment, The battleship was a bastion of order against chaos. But there were too many. The forces of uncreation swarmed over it, their strange entropic fields not melting or breaking its armor, but simply unmaking it. Its hull dissolved into shimmering static. Its guns fell silent. The battleship was being erased from existence piece by agonizing piece. The last thing the system saw was the brilliant silent flash of the Inflexible's reactor core breaching a final defiant star against the encroaching darkness. A punctuation mark at the end of a life lived by the book and ended by the spirit. A debt had been paid in blood and steel. Vance watched tears streaming down her face, her heart a knot of grief and awe. Kincaid, the rigid legalist, the man of collars and cages, had made the ultimate sacrifice. Not for a rule, but for a principle he had only just come to understand. His sacrifice was the judgment. His death was the key. He had balanced his own ledger, and in doing so, had given them all a chance to balance theirs. The Obsidian anchorage responded. The billions of crystalline shards scattered across light years of space began to glow. They resonated with the final lawful act of the inflexible. They hummed, and the hum rose into a choir, a sound that filled the entire system, with a note of pure, unwavering order. Lines of impossible energy woven from the very fabric of space-time connected them, forming a vast, intricate web, with the Veritas at its luminous center. Power on a cosmic scale, a tide of pure potential flooded into the ancient ship. Its sigils, once glowing, no longer shone. They burned with the white-hot intensity of creation. Power at 100%. Dyson choir active. Sacrifice acknowledged and recorded. Judgment of the anathema is required. Steward your verdict. Vance looked at the swarming nihilistic fleet, which had now turned its full attention to the re-energized Veritas. Kincaid had given her a chance paid for with everything he had. She would not waste it. Her grief was a fire in her chest, but her mind was ice cold. What was the proportional response to an enemy that sought only to erase? You could not mirror their actions. That would be to erase them to become the very thing you fought. You could not imprison them. They would simply unmake their prison. The law of balance. The law of the ledger required a different, more profound solution. If their crime was the erasure of meaning, then their sentence must be the imposition of meaning. The law was not a sword, but a forge. Veritas. She commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she had never known. An authority born of law and loss of grief and gratitude. Their nature is chaos and erasure. Let the verdict be order and creation. Do not destroy them. Do not banish them. Define them. Hold them to account. Verdict accepted. The law will be made manifest. The Veritas did not fire a single beam. It did not launch a single missile. Instead, the entire Dyson choir, the network of reality-shaping resonators stretching across the system, pulsed as one. It released a wave not of energy, but of pure information. It was a wave of absolute, unshakable physical law, a broadcast of the fundamental rules of the universe. It was not a weapon. It was a definition. The shadowy, chaotic ships of the anathema began to change. Their fluid, asymmetrical forms, which had shifted and warped like nightmares, froze. They hardened into solid, measurable shapes with defined mass volume and inertia. Their entropic fields, which had devoured reality, collapsed, replaced by standard thermal and electromagnetic signatures that bled waste heat into the void. Their impossible physics-defying drives sputtered and died suddenly and irrevocably, forced to obey the laws of conservation of energy. The Veritas had not destroyed them. It had tamed them. It had taken their chaotic, malevolent existence and forced it to conform to the very rules they sought to unmake. They were no longer thought thieves or reality eaters. They were just ships, crippled, inert, and suddenly horrifyingly subject to the mundane laws of physics. They were trapped not in a cage of energy, but in the unbreakable cage of reality itself. Their greatest weapon, their defiance of cosmic law, had been taken from them. They were rendered harmless not by violence, but by truth. A precedent was etched into the very fabric of the stars. In the aftermath, a stunned, profound silence held the system. The surviving ships of the Seventh Fleet, having finally regrouped, drifted amidst the fleet of newly solidified anathema vessels, their crews staring in silent disbelief at the impossible outcome. The Stargazer. Its hull scarred and scorched by the energy backlash from the choir's activation, limped closer to the silent waiting form of the Veritas. The cost had been terrifyingly high. The Inflexible was gone. A memory, a ghost of honor. With it, Admiral Kincaid and his entire crew had perished. The Stargazer's own port nacelle was a ruin of twisted metal, its outer hull pitted and burned. But they were alive, and history itself had been preserved. Weeks later, the story unfolded at a formal coalition inquiry. The logs from the Stargazer. The recovered black box of the Inflexible and the direct, unassailable testimony of the Veritas itself were presented to the highest echelons of the Admiralty and the civilian government. The tale was too vast, too strange to be believed. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. A new doctrine was born from the ashes of the battle, a protocol for dealing with the monumental discoveries that awaited humanity in the dark. It was named the Vance Doctrine. It was a new law based not on control, but on stewardship, not on suspicion, but on communication, and above all, on the principle of proportional measured response. The Veritas was declared the first sanctuary relic, a protected sovereign entity under coalition law, a living piece of heritage. And its designated guardian, its permanent steward and interpreter, was Commander Elara Vance. Her new ship, the newly commissioned CNS Kincaid's Honor, was assigned to her, a vessel built for long-term exploration and defense, a symbol of the Navy's newfound respect for the laws of the past. From the command deck of her new vessel, Vance watched the Veritas. It hung in the void, its mission now intertwined with her own. Its sigils glowed with a calm, steady light, a silent promise of order in a chaotic universe. The Dyson Choir array, its great work done, had once again cooled, appearing to all but the most sensitive instruments as a simple, unremarkable field of crystalline space junk. Her work had just begun. There were other relics, other ghosts, other ancient laws waiting in the endless darkness. She was no longer just an explorer. She was a keeper of the peace, a steward of memory, an advocate for the voiceless past. The law had awoken, and she was its voice. She looked at her command console, where a direct permanent link to the main ledger of the Veritas displayed its current status. It was a list of judgments and precedents stretching back 5,000 years. At the very bottom, a single new entry blinked with a soft white light. It was the last testament to the battle for the Obsidian Anchorage, a final accounting of the price of wisdom. It simply read, "Precedent established. Law affirmed. The universe remembers.